Chicago, 15 below zero. The wind cut down Michigan Avenue like a blade, and Jacob Miller hunched into the only coat he owned, a navy wool coat his wife had stitched by hand 4 years before cancer took her. Across the street, a woman sat alone at the bus stop. No coat, no gloves, lips the color of old bruises. People walked past her the way people walk past street lamps. Jacob touched the inside of his collar, where Sarah had embroidered 2 small letters, S and J. He thought of his 8-year-old son asleep in a hospital bed 2 miles away, waiting for a surgery he could never afford. Then, without a word, Jacob crossed the street and took off the coat. 3 days later, his phone rang, and the voice on the other end would rewrite his life. The apartment on the south side of Chicago had stopped being a home 4 years ago, on the day Sarah's voice went out of it for the last time. What was left was a place where Jacob Miller and his son slept and ate and tried to remember how to laugh. The radiator hissed in the corner of the living room like a wounded animal. The windows were thin. In winter, frost flowered on the inside of the glass by morning. Jacob was 34, though most mornings the bathroom mirror argued the point. He drove a delivery van for a freight company that ran through the dark hours, hauling packages out of a warehouse near the airport, while the rest of the city was busy sleeping. The job paid by the route, and the routes paid less every year. He had been doing it long enough that he no longer smelled the diesel on his jacket, only the smell of his son's hair when he leaned over the boy's bed before each shift. The boy's name was Oliver, and he was by any honest accounting the only thing Jacob still believed in. Oliver loved dinosaurs the way some children loved cartoons or candy, with a complete focused devotion. He could name 24 species by heart. He could explain why the Stegosaurus had 2 rows of plates running down its spine, and why scientists no longer believed it had a second brain in its hip. He kept a sketchbook beside his pillow, half filled with armored creatures and erupting volcanoes. The first pages bore his mother's careful looping handwriting beneath each drawing. Sarah had started the book with him when he was 4. They had drawn together every Sunday morning until the cancer made her hands too tired to hold a pencil. Oliver had never let anyone else write in those first pages. He had simply continued the book on the next blank sheet, drawing alone now the white gap between her last entry and his first feeling to him like the edge of a cliff. Every night before Jacob turned off the lamp, Oliver asked the same question. "Dad, can Mom see me?" Jacob had tried different answers over the years. He had tried the truth. He had tried faith. He had tried the soft, small lies that fathers tell when they cannot stand to leave a child empty-handed. Now he simply said, "Every minute, buddy. Every minute," and kissed the top of his son's head and walked out into the cold to drive his van until dawn. The trouble was that Oliver's heart had been wrong since the day he was born. A valve built crooked in the womb, a chamber that worked too hard to compensate. For most of his life, it had been a problem that lived on charts and ultrasound printouts, something to be watched, not yet repaired. But in the last year, the problem had grown teeth. There had been fainting spells. There had been a hospitalization in October. The cardiologist, a kind woman with tired eyes, had told Jacob the surgery could not be put off much longer. The estimate she had handed him afterward, slid across her desk like a piece of bad news she was sorry to deliver, was $320,000. Jacob had laughed when he saw it. Not because it was funny, because there was no other sound left in him. He had applied to 4 banks. All 4 had said no. The credit cards were closed. The savings account had been emptied 2 years ago, paying down the last of Sarah's medical bills. The landlord had taped a notice to the apartment door 3 weeks before Christmas, demanding 2 months of back rent in 14 days, or the locks would be changed. By the 2nd week of January, Oliver was back in the hospital. Not for surgery, for observation. His resting pulse had been climbing again, and the cardiologist wanted him where machines could watch him while she fought with the insurance company over a pre-authorization that everyone in the room knew would not be approved in time. Jacob slept in the chair beside the boy's bed when he could. The rest of the nights he drove. That was the life he had been carrying when the storm rolled in on the 11th of January, and a woman in a thin gray suit sat down at a bus stop on Michigan Avenue with no coat on and decided to wait there until the cold finished what it had started. His van died at the loading dock just before 3 in the morning. Jacob turned the key. He turned it again. He sat in the dark a long moment with his forehead pressed against the steering wheel, listening to the wind worry the metal walls of the warehouse, and tried to think of a single person he could call. There was no one. There had not been anyone for a long time. He locked the van and started walking. The bus would take him within 4 blocks of the hospital, and from the hospital, he could figure out something else. He was wearing the only coat he owned, the coat his wife had made him with her own hands. The coat was navy wool, double-stitched at every seam with deep pockets, and a collar she had cut from a heavier weight because she had known he would always work outside. On the inside of that collar in thread, the color of summer wheat, she had embroidered 2 letters S and J, small enough that no one but he would ever see them. He had worn the coat through 4 winters. He had never sent it to a cleaner, never trusted anyone else to touch it. There were nights when he believed he could still catch her perfume in the lining, though he knew that was no longer possible. She had finished it years before, in the slow, good months, before the disease ever came near her hands, and it was the last warm thing she had ever made him. He had walked 3 blocks down Michigan Avenue when he saw the woman at the bus stop. She was sitting very straight on the metal bench, the way a person sits when they have already decided not to ask for help. She wore a gray suit jacket of the kind people wore inside heated offices. No overcoat, no scarf, no gloves. Her hair had been pinned back in a careful style that had probably cost more than Jacob made in a week, and the snow had settled into it and was no longer melting. Her lips were the color of an old bruise. People walked past her, a young couple arms locked laughing into their scarves, a man in a long camel coat eyes on his phone, a woman pulling a small dog dressed in a sweater. None of them stopped. None of them looked. She was to that street and that hour a thing that simply did not exist. Jacob slowed. He told himself he had a son to get to. He told himself there was a bus to catch and a body of his own running on 3 hours of sleep and 1 warm meal in 24 hours. He told himself it was not his problem. He took 2 more steps. Then he stopped. He stood in the snow on the far edge of the sidewalk and reached under his collar with 2 cold fingers until he found the embroidered S and the J beside it. He thought of Sarah. He thought of the Sunday mornings she had spent at the kitchen table with the coat across her lap, biting thread with her front teeth, the way her own mother had taught her. He thought of what she had said to him near the end, when she had taken his hand in both of hers and made him promise not to become a smaller man after she was gone. He crossed the street. The woman did not look up as he approached. She was shivering in long, slow waves, now the kind of shivering that meant the cold had moved past the muscle and into the bone. Jacob did not say her name because he did not know it. He did not say his own. He simply took off the coat and the wind hit him like an open palm, and he laid the coat across her shoulders the way he used to lay a blanket across Oliver when the boy fell asleep on the couch. She lifted her head then. Her eyes were a color he could not place in the dim light somewhere between gray and the inside of a shell. "Don't return it," Jacob said. His voice came out lower than he had meant it to. "My wife made it. She would want it used for something kind." He turned and he walked away into the storm. Behind him, the woman sat very still under the weight of the coat. After a long moment, her hand drifted almost without her permission to the inside of the collar. Her fingers found 2 small ridges of embroidery there, in thread the color of summer wheat. She traced them once. She traced them again. And then, for the first time in many years, Eleanor Brooks lowered her head into her hands and made no sound at all. 3 mornings later, while Jacob was asleep on top of his blankets and his clothes, his phone rang. It was the hospital. Oliver's heart had slipped into a rhythm the monitors did not like. The on-call cardiologist had stabilized him, but there had been a moment around 3 in the morning when the line on the screen had flattened for longer than anyone in the room wanted to admit. The surgery could not wait any longer. They needed to operate within 14 days. They needed financial clearance by the end of the week. Jacob drove to the hospital with one hand on the wheel and the other pressed flat against his own chest, as if he could hold his heart together by force. He did not remember parking. He did not remember the elevator. He remembered only the door of the pediatric cardiac ward and the way Oliver's small face on the pillow looked too still under the soft blue overhead light. The boy opened his eyes when Jacob sat down beside him. Oliver said, his voice thinner than the day before. "I dreamed about Mom. What did she say, buddy?" "She said the Stegosaurus is my favorite for a reason." A faint smile climbed the edges of the oxygen cannula. "Because it has armor." Jacob did not trust his voice to answer. He took his son's hand, and he held it for a long time. Later that morning in the financial counseling office on the 3rd floor, a woman in a navy cardigan slid a piece of paper across the desk toward him. She did not look at him while she did it. Hospitals had taught her not to. "This is the estimate for the procedure," the woman said. "Plus the inpatient recovery follow-up, imaging the medications. We need a payment plan or proof of funding within 5 business days, or we'll need to discuss transferring your son to a public facility." Jacob looked at the number on the page. $321,460. He looked at it for what felt like a full minute. He did not cry. He had stopped being able to do that somewhere around the 3rd bank. "What public facility?" he said. "Cook County. They have a waiting list, but in a true emergency they can sometimes—" "How long?" "The waiting list." She glanced at her screen. She did not want to say it. "For pediatric cardiac, currently, 3 to 5 months. Oliver had 2 weeks. Jacob stood up. He thanked the woman because his mother had raised him to thank people even when they had just signed his son's death warrant, and he walked back toward the elevators with the estimate folded in his shirt pocket like a bomb. He passed through the broad marble sweep of the main lobby on his way out. He did not stop. He had no reason to stop. On the high wall above the donor plaque, a large oil portrait watched him cross the room. A woman of perhaps 50 in a charcoal suit, her hair pinned back in a careful chignon. Her eyes were a color the painter had captured in a way he probably did not understand, somewhere between gray and the inside of a shell. The brass plate beneath the painting read in letters Jacob did not see: Eleanor Brooks, Chair Brooks Memorial Foundation. Jacob walked under the painting and out into the cold without ever lifting his head. On the steps of the hospital, the snow had started again. He stood there and did the only math his exhausted mind could still do. 5 days. 5 days to find $321,000 he did not have in a city that had already told him no 4 times. He put a hand to his chest, where his coat used to be, and felt only the thin fabric of his work shirt and the cold pressing in through it. He did not know yet that a phone call was coming. He did not know yet that the woman in the painting upstairs had not slept in 2 nights. He did not know that in a glass office on the top floor of the hospital, he was now walking away from his son's name, had already been pulled from a list, and someone was already asking very quiet questions about a man, a coat, and a thread of embroidery the color of summer wheat. He only knew that he had failed, and he walked into the storm believing it. The 5th bank said no over a phone Jacob was holding outside the hospital in the snow. The man on the other end was polite. He was sorry. He used the word unfortunately 3 times in a single sentence. Jacob thanked him because his mother had raised him to thank people, and ended the call standing on the curb with his bare hand stiff around the phone. He drove back to the apartment to find a court summons stapled to the door. The landlord had moved the eviction date up by a week. The notice was already starting to curl in the cold air, the print blurred where snow had touched it. Jacob took it down. He stood in the dim hallway of the building and read it 3 times before he understood it. And then he understood it all at once. In the storage closet at the bottom of the stairs, leaning against a stack of paint cans the building had stopped using 2 summers ago, was the only thing he owned that anyone might want. A 1994 Honda motorcycle, faded red, the seat torn at one corner. He had bought it the year before he met Sarah, and he had not ridden it in 3 winters. Sarah had laughed at him about it. She had called it his beautiful, useless thing. She had also been the one to tell him not to sell it. Some things you keep, she had said, because losing them would be losing the man who bought them. He sold it that afternoon to a kid in Bridgeport for $300 in cash and not enough questions. The money covered 3 days of Oliver's inpatient stay. 3 days. Not the procedure. Not the recovery. 3 days of the bed. By Tuesday, he had run out of phone numbers. There was one number left, though, that he had been carrying for almost 2 years, like a stone in his pocket. It belonged to a man named Marco Castellano, who ran a small import business out of a back room in Pilsen, and who, for the right kind of customer, did not run an import business at all. Jacob had met him through a co-worker. He had taken the number on the night Sarah's medical debt had first crossed $100,000. He had never called it. He had told himself, that night, and every night since, that he would rather break apart slowly than borrow from a man who did not bother to write down what he was owed. He called Marco from the hospital parking lot on Tuesday afternoon. Marco listened. He did not interrupt. When Jacob finished, the line was quiet for a long beat, and then Marco said, in the calm, careful voice of a man who had made an entire life out of other people's worst days, "I can have 100,000 to you by tomorrow, the rest by Thursday. You and I will sit down on Friday and talk about what comes after." "What comes after?" Jacob said. "You don't need to ask that yet, Jacob. We can talk Friday." Jacob sat in his car a long time after they hung up. He did not drive. He did not turn the engine on. He watched the snow build along the wipers in small, careful drifts, and he understood that he had been offered a kind of mercy that was also a door he would not be able to walk back out of. He did not tell Marco yes. He did not tell him no. That night on the cardiac ward, Oliver was awake when Jacob came in. The boy was pretending not to have been crying. He had the sketchbook open on his lap, the new pencil Jacob had bought him still capped in his fingers. The page in front of him was a half-finished stegosaurus, the plates along its spine, drawn in the careful, deliberate way Oliver drew everything important. "Hi, buddy." "Hi, Dad." Jacob sat down on the edge of the bed. The mattress was thin and the rails were cold. He did not know how much of the hallway conversation outside had carried through the door. Oliver was 8 years old. Oliver was also the smartest person Jacob had ever lived with, including Sarah, and Sarah had read books in 2 languages. "Dad," Oliver said, not looking up from the page, "what happens if I don't have the surgery?" "That's not going to happen." "But what if?" Jacob drew a breath. He had rehearsed answers to every other question. He had not rehearsed this one. "It's not going to happen, Oliver." The boy nodded the way children nod when they have decided generously to let the adult lie to them. He turned the page of the sketchbook. On a fresh sheet, he began to draw a small stegosaurus, simpler than the one before, smaller, with a careful banner of words beneath it. "This one is for Mom. If I see her first, I'll give it to her." He wrote the words the way an 8-year-old writes large, even careful at the corners. Then he closed the book and laid it across his chest, and looked up at his father with a calm so complete that Jacob felt it like a hand around his throat. Jacob made it as far as the hallway outside the ward before his legs went out from under him. He sat down on the cold linoleum with his back to the wall, and for the first time in 4 years, for the first time since the morning he had watched the nurses cover Sarah's face, he cried. He cried without a sound because he was a man in a public hallway, and his son was sleeping 10 feet away, and the only thing he had left to lose was already on the other side of that door. The decision came in his sleep, or rather, The lack of decision did. By Wednesday morning, he had not called Marco back, and the not calling back had begun to feel like its own kind of answer. He could not do it. He could not put his son's life inside a debt his son might one day be asked to pay. He would go to the hospital. He would beg the financial office for another week. He would beg on his knees if he had to. And then, if begging did not work, he would call Marco at noon. He arrived at the front desk of the third-floor financial office at 9:08, hat in his hand. The woman behind the glass, the same woman in the navy cardigan from the day before, looked up at him and went still. "Mr. Miller," she said, "could you wait a moment, please?" She picked up the phone. She spoke too quietly for him to hear. She set the phone down again. Then she did something Jacob did not expect. She smiled. It was a small, professional smile, the kind hospital staff are trained to deploy on rare occasions, and it did not quite reach her eyes, but on a face that had refused to look at him the day before, it was a different country. "Your son's account has been brought to a zero balance," she said. "All charges to date, the procedure, the post-operative care, the room, everything." Jacob looked at her. He did not understand what he was hearing. His mouth opened, and what came out of it was not the word he had meant to say. "What?" "All of it. Paid in full this morning. By an anonymous donor." He stood very still in front of the glass. The fluorescent light above her hummed in a frequency he could suddenly hear. Somewhere down the hall, an elevator chimed. He thought about asking her to repeat herself, and then he thought about how stupid he was going to sound if he did, and instead, he said with as much steadiness as he could find, "I think there's been a mistake." "There hasn't been." "There has to be. Nobody pays that kind of money for somebody they don't know." The woman's smile faltered at the edges. "I understand, sir. I do. But I'm looking at the wire confirmation. The funds cleared at 4:47 this morning. The donor has requested that their identity not be disclosed. Then I'd like to speak with whoever can disclose it. That isn't going to be possible. Then I'd like to speak with your director." She hesitated. Then she picked up the phone again, and 20 minutes later, Jacob was in the office of a tired, bald man named Gerald Whitcomb, who repeated in slightly different words exactly what the woman in the cardigan had told him. The bill was paid. The donor was anonymous. The hospital had a fiduciary obligation to respect that. The surgery would proceed as originally scheduled. There would be no transfer to Cook County. There would be no more conversations about money. When Jacob asked why the man did not have an answer, when Jacob asked who the man said only, "Somebody who I gather would prefer to remain a private benefactor." Jacob left the office and went straight to the pediatric ward. Oliver was asleep. The monitor above the bed beat its small, steady rhythm. Jacob stood beside the bed for a long time, watching the boy breathe. He felt in his chest a relief so large it felt indistinguishable from suspicion. In Jacob's world, nobody gave anything for nothing. Sarah's hospice had not. The bank had not. The landlord had not. Even Marco in his own way had not. The universe Jacob lived in had certain consistent rules, and the first of those rules was that $321,000 did not appear in your son's name overnight unless someone wanted something back. He went down to the lobby. He intended to wait. He intended to make himself impossible to ignore until somebody slipped and told him who had done this and what they expected from him. He took the long way around the central atrium so that he could look more carefully at the photographs along the donor wallboard, members, past chairmen, the founders. That was when he stopped under the portrait. He had walked beneath it the day before without seeing it. Today, he saw it. A woman of perhaps 50 in a charcoal suit hair, pinned back in a careful chignon. The painter had been a good painter in his way. He had captured the line of her jaw and the calm in her hands, and the small, almost private smile at the corner of her mouth. But what he had really captured, and what he had probably not understood, he had captured. Was her eyes that strange, pale iridescence which Jacob had last seen at 3 in the morning on a bench on Michigan Avenue? Jacob's hand went to his collar without his telling it to. The fingers found nothing there. No wool, no embroidered S, no embroidered J. Only the cheap, thin fabric of the work shirt he was still wearing, and the cold underneath it. The brass plate beneath the painting read, Eleanor Brooks, Chair Brooks, Memorial Foundation. His hands were very cold suddenly. He read the plate a second time, as though the letters might rearrange themselves into something else. They did not. He looked back up at the eyes in the painting, and he saw clearly now, in a way he had not been able to see, in the dim light of Michigan Avenue at 3 in the morning, the woman at the bus stop. A janitor pushing a wet mop down the corridor moved around him, glanced up, and went back to his work. Jacob did not notice. He was for the first time in 3 days completely still. He waited in the atrium for 2 hours before anyone came for him. When they did, it was not a nurse, and it was not a guard. It was a polite young man in a charcoal suit who introduced himself only by saying that the board of directors would like a word with Mr. Miller if Mr. Miller had a moment. The elevator carried them past floors Jacob had not known the building contained. The top of Brooks Memorial was a different hospital from the one downstairs, quiet carpet underfoot. Long windows, looking out over a frozen Lake Michigan walls, hung with prints of paintings Jacob did not recognize. The young man led him down a corridor and into a conference room where a long oak table waited under low brass lamps, and at the head of that table sat a man Jacob had never seen before in his life. The man was perhaps 60, silver hair combed back from a high forehead, a dark gray suit cut more carefully than Jacob's apartment had ever been cleaned. He stood when Jacob came in, but he did not extend a hand. "Mr. Miller," the man said. "My name is Richard Hale. I serve as vice chair of this foundation's board of directors. Please, sit." Jacob sat. The young man left them, and for a long moment Richard Hale studied Jacob over the rim of a coffee cup. He did not drink. He did not speak. The studying went on long enough that Jacob began to feel it, the way a man feels a thermometer being held against his skin. "I have read your file," Richard said at last. "The hospitals and a small one, I prepared myself. You drive a delivery van for a freight company near O'Hare. You are 4 months behind on your rent. You have been denied credit by 5 lenders in the last 6 weeks. You owe approximately $47,000 in remaining medical debt from the death of your wife. And on Tuesday afternoon, you placed a phone call to a man named Marco Castellano, whom the Cook County Prosecutor's Office has investigated on 3 separate occasions for usurious lending." Jacob's stomach turned slowly like a key in a lock. "Mr. Hale, I am not accusing you of anything, Mr. Miller. I am establishing context. The board you are about to address operates on context." "What board?" "This one." Richard set the coffee cup down. $321,460 left this foundation's accounts this morning without the approval of this board. That has not happened in the 17 years I have served on it. I would like to understand how it came to happen now." Before Jacob could answer, the door opened behind him. He did not need to turn around to know who it was. He could feel her in the room, the way a person feels a window opening at night. He turned anyway. Eleanor Brooks stood in the doorway, in a deep charcoal coat over a deep charcoal suit, a thin scarf the color of dried blood at her throat. No jewelry except a single plain wedding band on her right hand. Her hair was pinned back exactly as the painter had painted it. She did not look like a woman who had spent 40 minutes shivering on a metal bench 3 nights ago. She looked like a woman who could close down a hospital wing with a phone call. She looked at Richard first. She looked at Jacob second. When her eyes found Jacob's, they did not flinch. "I'm sorry I didn't tell you who I was," she said. "That night I had just come from a funeral. I had walked further than I meant to. I sat down at that bench because my legs would not carry me to a cab." Jacob did not know what to say. He found with some surprise that he was angry. He had not expected to be angry. He had expected gratitude. He had expected confusion. He had not expected the small, hard thing that was now rising in his chest like a fist. "You paid my son's bill," he said. "Yes." "Why?" Eleanor came around the table and stopped at the corner nearest him, not sitting. "Because for 3 days after you handed me that coat, I waited to see whether you would come to find me, whether you would learn who I was and ask for something. You did not. You did not even take my name." Her head tilted very slightly. "I have spent 40 years in a world where everyone takes my name, Mr. Miller. You did not. That is why I paid. That's not a reason to pay $321,000. It is the only reason I have ever needed." Richard Hale at the head of the table exhaled audibly through his nose. "Eleanor," he said. "Sit down, please." She did not sit. "This is not the conversation we agreed to have, Richard. It is the conversation the bylaws require us to have. You moved Foundation Capital without board authorization on the basis of, with respect, a sentimental encounter on a public sidewalk. I am required as vice chair to ask whether that encounter is what you say it is." Jacob looked between them, and he understood with a slow sinking clarity that he had walked into a room in which he was not the topic, but the evidence. Behind Eleanor, on a small side table near the window, was a single object that did not match anything else in the room. A silver picture frame, perhaps 4 inches square. The frame was old, in the way silver gets old, slightly tarnished at the corners, polished gently along the edges. The photograph inside showed a boy of perhaps 7, with Eleanor's eyes, holding a baseball glove that was too big for his hand. Jacob's gaze passed across it and then away. He did not stop. He had other things to look at. Richard, watching him, did stop on it. For just a second. Then his attention came back to Jacob, and his voice, when he spoke, was perfectly even. "Mr. Miller, I am going to be very direct with you. The board will be reviewing this transaction. We will be reviewing your financial history, your work history, your communications, and your associations. If everything is as Mrs. Brooks describes it, no harm will come to you. If it is not, if there is any indication that you knew who she was that night, or that you have spoken with anyone who did, I will recommend that the Foundation pursue the recovery of every dollar of that wire transfer. From you, from your wages, from the estate of your son if it comes to that." Jacob felt the room narrow. "I didn't know who she was," he said. "I believe you may well be telling the truth," Richard said. "It does not matter what I believe. It matters what we can show." Eleanor's hand, resting on the back of the chair beside her, tightened until her knuckles went pale. She did not look at Richard. She looked at Jacob. "I'm sorry," she said very quietly. "I did not intend to put you in this room." Jacob stood. He did not know he was going to stand until he was already on his feet. "I gave you a coat," he said. "That's all that happened. I don't want your money. I don't want your name. I'd give back every dollar of it if I could, and I would still walk out of here owing you nothing. But you spent it on my son, and you spent it before you asked me whether I wanted you to. So now we are in this room. And I would like very much, sir," he turned just slightly toward Richard Hale, "to leave it." Nobody stopped him when he walked out. The article appeared in the Friday morning edition of the Chicago Tribune, page 3 above the fold. A photograph of Eleanor Brooks at a charity gala, beside a photograph of Jacob's apartment building, taken from across the street at dawn. The headline asked the question it didn't need to answer. "Billionaire rescued by delivery driver. An act of kindness or a well-laid plan." The reporter had been thorough. She had the 4 bank denials. She had the eviction notice. She had Marco Castellano's name sourced, though Jacob would not learn this until weeks later from a private investigator's file commissioned out of a silver-haired vice chair's office on the top floor of Brooks Memorial. She had 3 neighbors willing to call him a little off, a little too quiet, the kind of man who kept things to himself. The principal of Oliver's elementary school called Jacob at 10 in the morning to ask with great delicacy whether the family might consider a different educational environment once Oliver returned. The landlord, who had ignored Jacob's calls for 3 weeks, called twice in an hour. By noon, the foundation's board had voted 7-2 to formally request that Eleanor rescind the gift. The vote was not binding on her personal capacity. Eleanor was a Brooks, and the foundation carried her father's name, but Richard had come prepared. A bylaw from 1998 allowing the board to file fiduciary review of any officer whose actions might constitute material misuse of position. The filing alone would freeze Eleanor's signing authority for up to 6 months. 6 months Oliver did not have. At 3 in the afternoon, the hospital administrator called Jacob into a small office near the surgical wing and explained with practiced regret that pending financial verification, the procedure scheduled for Monday morning would be moved. "How long?" Jacob said. 48 hours at the soonest, possibly longer. Jacob sat with his hands flat on his knees. He did not raise his voice, because raising his voice would have meant breaking something he was not yet ready to break. "You told me 2 weeks, he said. "We are at day 11. The administrator did not answer. There was no answer. That night, Oliver's pulse climbed for the 3rd time in 12 hours. The cardiologist increased one medication and added a second. The boy was awake when Jacob came back into the room, but he did not have the strength to sit up. He did not have the strength to draw. His sketchbook lay closed on the rolling table beside the bed, the pencil resting across the cover in the careful, exact way Oliver always laid his pencils. Jacob sat on the edge of the mattress and took the book into his lap. He did not know exactly why he opened it. Some part of him simply wanted to see his son's hand on a page, the way a man wants photographs of a person who is still in the room with him because a quiet voice has begun whispering that the room is shrinking. He turned past the stegosaurus with the careful plates. He turned past the volcano. He turned to the last drawing in the book, which Oliver had finished the night before, and he stopped. 3 figures holding hands in a row. A man with Jacob's beard and Jacob's heavy work boots. A woman in a long dress, her hair pinned back the way Sarah had worn hers on Sundays. A small boy between them. All 3 were smiling. Beneath the drawing in Oliver's even careful handwriting, "If I go." "Dad, please don't be sad. Mom said she'll take care of me. She said you have to take care of you." Jacob closed the book. He set it back on the table. He did not weep. He sat in the chair beside his sleeping son with his hands folded in his lap, and he thought with a clarity that arrived like a blade that he had done this, that if he had walked past the bus stop, if he had let the woman freeze, if he had been the kind of man Sarah had begged him not to become, then his son would have been in surgery on Monday morning. That the coat had killed him. That kindness of all things had killed his son. Outside the hospital window, the snow had begun to fall again. It fell on Michigan Avenue and on the empty bench where Eleanor Brooks had sat 11 nights before, and on the long, dark city. Inside the room, Jacob Miller laid his forehead against the metal rail of his son's bed and waited for the first time in his life for the world to stop being something he could fight. She came to the apartment a little after 11 that night. Jacob heard the knock through the thin door, 3 slow, even taps the kind a person makes when they are not sure they have the right to be standing where they are standing. He had been sitting at the kitchen table in the dark, the sketchbook open in front of him to the page Oliver had drawn. He had not turned on a light because he had not wanted to see the drawing under one. He opened the door without checking. He did not particularly care anymore who it was. Eleanor Brooks stood in the hallway, in a long black coat, the same charcoal scarf at her throat. The collar of the coat was speckled with melting snow. In her arms, folded carefully, The way one folds something one has been carrying a long way was a coat of navy wool. "May I come in?" she said. He stepped back without answering. She set the coat down on the kitchen table beside the sketchbook, slowly, as if both of them were objects that might break. She did not sit. The apartment was small enough that not sitting in it felt like apology. "It's been cleaned," she said. "I had it cleaned by a tailor my mother used. He's 86 years old, and he does not know who I am. He does not know who you are either. I wanted you to have it back without any of this on it." Jacob looked at the coat. He did not touch it. "I told you not to return it." "I'm not returning it. I'm bringing something else, and I needed an excuse to come in." From the inside pocket of her own coat, she drew a slim white envelope. She set it on top of the wool. "That is not money," she said. "Open it when I am gone, not before. It is a single document signed at 6 o'clock this evening by myself and 2 witnesses transferring the cost of your son's procedure from the Foundation's accounts to a private trust drawn against my personal assets. The board cannot reverse what they cannot reach. The surgery is scheduled for 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. The administrator has already been informed." Jacob's hand drifted toward the envelope and did not pick it up. "Why," he said. "And don't tell me about the bench, Mrs. Brooks. I am too tired for the bench." For the first time since he had met her, her composure shifted. Something underneath it gave a fraction of an inch, the way a wall gives, before it remembers it is a wall. "My son was named Daniel," she said. She had not sat down. She did not sit down now. She turned very slowly toward the small window over the kitchen sink, which looked out onto an air shaft and a single street lamp that had not worked all winter, and she spoke to the dark glass. He was 7. He was walking home from school. He took a shortcut he was not supposed to take through an alley behind a row of brownstones on West Fullerton. He was hit by a delivery truck whose driver had been awake for 19 hours. The driver kept going. Daniel was not killed by the impact. He was killed by the cold and by the time on the ground. 40 minutes. The medical examiner was very precise about the 40 minutes. He was conscious for most of them. Jacob did not speak. 11 people walked past him in that alley, Eleanor said. "We know because the police interviewed all 11 of them. Some of them said they thought he was sleeping. Some of them said they didn't see him. 2 of them said they saw him and assumed someone else would call. The last was a woman who had a phone in her hand and was looking down at it when she stepped over his legs. She testified to that under oath. She said she did not look up." She turned back from the window. "I built this foundation, Mr. Miller, with the money my husband left me and the money my father left me before that. I built it on one condition I made with myself, which is that no child within reach of my hands would die for 40 minutes in a place where no one would stop. I have spent 22 years building it. And then 3 nights ago I went to a small private service for Daniel his anniversary, which I observed by myself, and on the way home I did something I have done every year on that night, which is that I took off my coat and I sat down on a bench and I waited." For what? For the world to do to me what it did to him, to see if I would still be sure, after all these years, that the world it would do it to him in is the world we live in. Eleanor's hands, very still at her sides, folded together in front of her. "You were the only one who stopped Mr. Miller. In 22 years of doing this on that bench or others in that coat or no coat in this city. You were the first." Jacob looked at the coat on his kitchen table. He looked at the photograph in the frame inside his head, the 7-year-old boy with the too large baseball glove and the eyes the color of the inside of a shell, and he understood that he had walked past that photograph 3 days ago without knowing what he was walking past. "I'm sorry," he said. It was a small word, and it carried almost nothing of what he meant. "Don't be sorry." You gave my son something I had not been able to give him in 22 years. You gave him a world in which somebody crossed the street." She moved to the door and stopped at the threshold, one hand on the frame. 7 o'clock tomorrow, she said. I will be in the waiting room. You do not have to speak to me. He did speak to her in the end. The waiting room of the pediatric cardiac wing was a long, quiet space with low blue chairs and a coffee machine that had been broken since November. Jacob sat in one of the chairs near the window. Eleanor sat in one near the door. Between them was a stretch of carpet and 9 empty seats, and for the first 3 hours of the surgery, neither of them moved. It was Eleanor who got up first. She came across the carpet without ceremony and sat down 2 chairs away from him, leaving the one between them empty out of some instinct neither of them named. She told him then the things she had not told him in his kitchen. That Daniel had loved baseball, which Jacob had guessed from the photograph, but had hated playing it, which Jacob had not. That the boy had been a reader, that he had been afraid of dogs and unafraid of the dark, and had been in his short life a child who said, "I love you" easily, and often the way some children do, and most do not. She told him about the husband who had not survived the grief. She told him about the years immediately after in which she had not been a person so much as a procedure carrying out the routines of a life. She told him that the foundation had saved her by becoming a thing she could do with her hands. Jacob told her about Sarah. He told her about the kitchen table and the wool and the embroidered S and the embroidered J. He told her about the way Sarah had bitten thread with her front teeth and laughed when he had said she was going to chip a tooth. He told her about the morning Sarah had taken his hand in both of hers and made him promise not to become a smaller man. He told her about the question Oliver asked every night before sleep. The conversation was not long. The conversation was not in any obvious way important. But by the time the surgeon came through the doors at the far end of the waiting room, still in his cap, the mask pulled down around his neck, the carpet between them had become a different carpet, and the silence between them had become a different silence. The surgeon's face told them before his words did. "Mr. Miller, he came through. The valve replacement was clean. He's in recovery. We'll watch him for the next 48 hours, but I have no concerns at this hour that I didn't have when I went in." Jacob stood. He did not move. He stood with his hands at his sides, and Eleanor, 2 seats down, brought a hand up to her mouth and held it there. The press did not break the next morning. It broke, in a manner of speaking, on Friday. A nurse who had worked under Eleanor for 20 years and had in that time accumulated certain recordings she had not known what to do with, sent one of those recordings to a reporter at the Tribune. In the recording, which had been made on a personal phone, left running on a conference table in the boardroom of Brooks Memorial. 16 days before any of this began, Richard Hale could be heard explaining to 2 other board members his theory that Eleanor's continued chairmanship was, in his phrase, no longer compatible with the institution's commercial direction, and that the right kind of scandal timed correctly might be expected to do what years of polite maneuvering had not. The Tribune ran the second article on the front page. The headline read, "A coat, a cover-up, and a quieter story than we told you." Richard Hale tendered his resignation by the end of the week. The foundation issued a public apology to Jacob Miller, hand-delivered to his apartment by the same young man in the charcoal suit who had taken him up to the conference room 3 days before. The young man, Jacob noticed, did not look so much like a man in a charcoal suit anymore. He looked perhaps like somebody's son. 6 months later, the snow had melted and frozen and melted again, and Oliver had returned to the 3rd grade with a long, neat scar he was very proud of, and a sketchbook that was nearly full. Eleanor founded a second fund inside the foundation that spring. It was a small fund at first, by foundation standards $12 million, seeded from her personal estate. The board did not contest it. The board had learned in the months since Richard's departure to stop contesting Eleanor when her mouth set in the particular line it had set in across the conference table on a Wednesday afternoon in January. She called the fund the Sarah and Daniel Foundation. She asked Jacob to run it. He said yes on one condition. The condition was that he be allowed to continue driving his delivery route 2 nights a week. He explained it with some difficulty. He said that he was afraid of who he might become without the route. He said that he had met her on a night he had been walking home from one. He said that if he stopped, he was afraid he would forget where he had been when he had been the man she had thanked him for being. Eleanor did not argue. A year passed. On the 11th of January, the city of Chicago turned cold again. Not as cold as it had been the year before, there was no 15 below. This time, no wind that cut. Only the ordinary deep cold of a Midwestern night and a soft, steady snow that fell on Michigan Avenue and on the parked cars and on the metal bench at a bus stop 2 blocks from the river. Jacob's delivery van pulled up at the curb a little after 2 in the morning. He was wearing a new coat. It was a good coat, well-cut, double-lined, with a heavy collar that kept the wind off his neck. Eleanor had given it to him on his birthday. In the inside pocket of that new coat, folded into a small, careful square, he carried the old one. He carried it everywhere he went. He did not unfold it. He did not need to. He could feel the embroidered S and the embroidered J through the fabric without ever lifting the lining, and that was enough. At the bus stop, a young man sat alone on the metal bench. No coat. Bare hands tucked under his arms. Hair the color of wet straw. He was perhaps 22 years old, and he was sitting the way people sit when they have already decided not to ask for help. Jacob stepped down from the van. He did not say anything. He crossed the sidewalk, took off the new coat, and laid it across the young man's shoulders, the way a man lays a blanket across a sleeping son. The young man looked up. "Don't return it," Jacob said. "Somebody made it for somebody kind. They'd want it used the same way." He turned and he walked back to the van, and he drove on into the snow. In his shirt pocket, the small square of navy wool sat warm against his chest, and the city closed behind him like a hand.